All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Housing 2022, The Devil's in the Details. My name is Tiffany Tononi McNamara, and I'm the Executive Director for Plan New Hampshire. And we're very excited to be hosting this workshop today and moderating this dialogue about housing. It's obviously a huge topic. But we're going to be diving a little bit into what those details are that make up, I guess, the devil that is housing. Real quickly, I do want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to share my screen. And thank our sponsor first and foremost. Thank you, North Branch Construction, for helping this take place. Even virtual events have costs associated, so we really appreciate their support. Most of you, many of you, I saw the list of registrants are currently members of plans. So this isn't news to many of you or your longtime supporters, even if you're not members. But I do like to include this slide and just really remind everyone that the focus of our mission here is to foster excellence in planning, design, and development of New Hampshire's built environment. We do that in a lot of different ways, but one of those ways are these educational events and these workshops. And whether they're virtual or in person, we really try to bring that value to our members, our supporters, and our audience. Because I'm still new, I just wanted to also take a minute to let people know who I am and who our membership coordinator is. Many of you have probably received emails from Cecilia. This is the plan staff, small but mighty, and we're honored today to have my predecessor here with us. Robin LeBlanc's here on the call as well. So I just want people to know who Cecilia and I are, and that we are here to be contacted at any time. Our email addresses and our phone numbers there on the slide. So please don't be shy. And to our program. So today we have two speakers. Many of you are very familiar with them, I believe. So we have George Reagan, the Community Engagement Manager from New Hampshire Housing, and Harrison Kanzler, the Executive Director for the Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition. And they're really going to be diving into what some of these details are that make up our current housing challenges here in New Hampshire. They're going to touch on a lot of different topics. Some of those were communicated in the event marketing materials, such as the economics of development, the impact of land use regulations on housing supply, affordability, current trends and community resistance to housing solutions, and what role regionalism plays, and of course, what are some of the strategies that they've seen, but also hopefully some of the strategies you all have seen and have been a part of that are really moving the needle in terms of community engagement and community education and awareness about the housing issues and solutions that are out there. And they're just going to generally dive in deeper to what those details, the devil in the details are. So you'll probably hear us say that a few times today, but it feels pretty especially appropriate to the topic of housing. And really quickly, just so folks know, there will be AIA and AICP, yes, credits, CEUs available for this event. So just let me know if you need anything from us on that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're recording the session. We're going to provide that to all of the registrants later this week, and it will be public on our website 30 days from today. And after George and Harrison present and speak, we are going to have a dedicated time for Q&A and hopefully even discussion with the group, because we're not such an unwieldy huge group that we can't maybe have a little bit of discussion. Until that time, please remain muted. You can throw questions into the chat feature, and we're going to do our best to monitor that and see if some of those questions can be answered while we're talking and while we're presenting. And if not, we can return to them during the Q&A time. Harrison figured out something very important for us, which is that for those of you who don't have the raise hand feature, which I did not know that everyone doesn't have that on their Zoom, if you hit Alt Y, your hand will be raised. So we'll remind everyone of that later, because the raise hand feature will just help us keep discussion a little more organized. And again, please feel free to throw your questions in the chat along the way. So before we get started, I want to introduce George and Harrison. I think a lot of you are very familiar with them, but I'm going to read their bios for those who may not be as familiar. I know people love their bios being read out loud, but I'm doing it anyways, you guys. So George has been the community engagement manager at New Hampshire Housing since 2008. And in his role, he helps communities and organizations show the connection between an adequate and balanced supply of housing and economic growth and stability. He works with public officials, organizations, and business partners, as well as regional workforce housing advocacy groups to provide education, technical assistance, and support. He's also a master of the metaphor, so I'm hoping we're going to hear a few of those today, because I've been really enjoying them. Yes, metaphors and other things along those lines. Harrison Kansler is a North Conway native who grew up in the family-owned and operated Cranmore Inn, where he learned about the tourism industry of the Mount Washington Valley firsthand. After settling down and starting a family in the Mount Washington Valley area, Harrison realized that the threat of housing shortages that faced the valley, he called home, and he wanted to really get involved in those issues. So he held office as representative for Carroll County District 2 during the 2019-2020 biennium and worked with the Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition to put forward pro-housing legislation. And when the position of executive director opened up with the coalition, he decided to exit state politics and focus on working with the towns of the Mount Washington Valley on housing issues. He currently lives in North Conway with his wife and 2 children. And those are our speakers today. So we're really excited to kick this off. George is going to begin. And he is going to give us a little bit of context around housing before we start a dialogue between George and Harrison. So let me stop my screen share. Hello, faces. And let George take it away.
Thank you, Tiffany, for inviting us. Harrison, I want to say that's a really hip picture of you. I feel like a way too formal, but I'm not sure I would have the same look if I donned flannel. But I do want to thank you all for having us talk with you. Hopefully, you'll get some good information out of it and some really good conversation. I want to just talk a little bit about New Hampshire Housing for those that don't know. We're a self-funded organization. We're not a department of New Hampshire, but we are sort of tied back to them with our 9-member board of directors. And our mission, as you see there, is to promote, finance, and support affordable housing and related services in New Hampshire. And for those of you, again, that looked at my opening slide and said, well, if the devil's in the details, he certainly doesn't know how to spell it. I did that on purpose. Anybody notice that? I'm not seeing, right. Anyway, well, that was funny also in rehearsal. But for those of you that know me, I am atrocious at spelling, so some of them would think that's just kind of a normal thing for me. Anyway, so I want to provide a little bit of background on the housing market. And I know many of you have sort of seen this before, but I thought it would be important just to sort of realize where are we. So talking about the rental market, we do, and we're getting ready to start our 2022 New Hampshire Housing Rent Survey. This is information culminating from our most recent one, which was last year, looking at the median gross rental cost in New Hampshire. So this is New Hampshire. And the median means that this is the midpoint. Half the rents are higher, half are lower. And when I talk about gross, I mean rent and utilities that are included. So when you look at that sort of bluish line, we're topping out at 2-bedroom units at about a little under $1,500 a month for the median gross rent. And for all of the units, about a little under $1,400, about $1,373, as you see there. One of the striking things that I always tend to mention is all through the recession, which you see kind of back there and coming out of it in 2011, rents never never really went down. They went up, and you can see down the bottom that just from last year, the increase. And if you look over the last couple of years, about 24% and 23%. So that's significant in terms of what people are going through with job loss, unemployment or underemployment, looking for places to rent and to live that were affordable. And then sort of looking at it from the vacancy rate perspective, looking at it below 1%. So we're talking about just a real dearth of rental units that's available. You'll see in another slide, a balanced market is somewhere around 5%. Turnover is like 3%. Now we're below 1%. So that's a real challenge. And here's what it looks like throughout the state. So even if you look up at Coas County, rents may be lower, median, but you're looking at the percent change over the last 5 years, even up there. And in every county, rents increased. Certainly down in the southern region, coastal region, and Upper Valley, that Grafton, that's largely driven by Hanover and Lebanon. And looking across the state by county, you see that balance and turnover. So if anyone sort of says, that we don't have a problem with rental units, this data is pretty clear, as well as talking to most people that are looking to find a place to live. And I don't know if you've heard this, but more people that are living in a place and they're finding their rent going up by hundreds of dollars, just like in the following month. And that's because property is valuable. Maybe it turns over and a new buyer comes in and they need to charge that. On the for sale side, we're seeing the same thing. The median sales price, again, the median point. If you look back to 2004 and 5, that was our housing bubble. And now we're up topping almost into the 400,000 range. And over the last couple of years, about a 33% increase. So again, what does that mean? It's tougher for first-time home buyers. Part of that is fueled by we've got a growing economy. We have record low interest rates, even though they're climbing up, but they're still very low from probably many of us on this call whose experience of 6 and 8% interest rates. And then with that, much like on the rental side, a really low housing inventory. Sellers market is about 6 months. We're well below that. So people are buying more than the asking price, foregoing inspections. And that's just tougher on people that have to be more connected to the credit market and having a significant down payment. So that's a bit about some of the people and what the market is in terms of purchase and rent. And then just looking at, we just haven't kept up with building permits and building. And I think, we see in our communities perhaps lots of building happening, but a lot of that has been pent up over the last several years. And so the blue line is single family units. So that's improving, but at a much slower pace than pre-recession, even though our economy is really, really growing. And certainly in the multifamily apartment rentals, 5 units or more, it's kind of volatile. So we're seeing some uptick, but just not enough. And so this gets to, what are some of those challenges? Why aren't builders building more? And this is sort of it. This is the 5 L's, the economics of development that I think a lot of us have sort of talked about. And when we're trying to work with communities, it's a lot to take in and to try to understand, but it's really, really important, especially right now. No matter what we do, we can't get around just the sheer cost of labor, lumber and materials. That's a real factor. And in conversations about how to overcome that, that's a real challenge. Same thing with the labor force. There's a need for that, especially in places like maybe in the North Country where there's less of that skilled talent that's just readily available. And so there's a competition for that workforce to build those units, single family, multifamily. Land is another really important piece. Land is finite, but the intensity of the use is really up to local and state government and other factors on how to use that, and is a really important key. The ability to finance projects is really, really important, and that can be a challenge. And then we get down to regulatory practices, laws, and that's where we see the interplay between land use and regulatory practices that might constrain what can be done with a piece of land. And so all those kind of come together and are important to understand when we're trying to deal with and understand the triggers and levers for creating housing, number one, and affordable housing. And what is that? We talk a lot about missing middle housing. And so this seems to be, in a lot of places, the things that are harder to build these days. If those of you that attended, we had Karen Perolik on, I think in February, talking about this in the book Missing Middle. This is their sort of illustration. If you're familiar with HB House Bill 1177, Ivy Van's, multifamily bill that's just recently tabled, it was to try to allow some of this to happen. So I think there's a lot of understanding or agreement that we've got a housing problem, but it's hard to allow this to happen for all those reasons I stated earlier, not the least of which is that in a lot of places we really favor single family zoning. And that's something, that's the challenge. That's part of this devil in the details to talk about. And so to kind of cross into that, I'm always, when I came across this Malcolm Gladwell quote, the key to good decision making is not knowledge, it's understanding. And he states we're swimming in the former and lacking the latter. Why I think this is important is that there's a lot of us housers and other people that are sort of very knowledgeable about housing, about land use regulations. If only this would fix it. And but what I think is so important in this world of trying to, I think, affect change is the understanding part of it. It's not just what do I know, but how do I know how that connects to other things like my community, like conservation, like economy, to my not only my community, but in my neighborhood, my neighbor, my family, my friends. And I think it's that that intersection and that's really, really important in trying to get beyond what I know and understand what it means to me and my community. And that's kind of a larger thing to deal with. And so how do we do that? And this gets down to some of the major things of engagement. And I think that, and I'll show a couple of examples before I move on to Harrison, but this comes from the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. And the coalitions are great and other people for doing a lot of things, not the least of which is talking about the problem, educating, and trying to connect in communities. And this is sort of a bit that includes some feedback loops about what does it mean to really connect and talk about this subject. And one thing is to maybe not just talk, but to be able to provide opportunities to connect with people and to engage and to listen. And from listening, making housing story a human thing, a real and relatable subject that can be talked about in the first person rather than through data and through jargon and terminology. I believe, and I've seen this, that you can win or lose based on how you approach that. I think we could all say that maybe if we just allowed, multifamily in every single family zoned zone, could really sort of help deal with this, but that means that we don't allow for public discourse and understanding, so we can rise above and understand how that fits in with our community, our economy, and again, our neighbors, me, my friends, my family. So that's just one example. And the other piece is that we try to provide some technical assistance and resources to other people trying to work on this, and that's housing. Our housing partner program. So the Washington Valley Housing Coalition is funded in part through that. One of our former board members, Harvey Schwartz, was very, very focused on being able to provide training to planning and zoning board volunteers. So that's a fund that's underutilized, and we probably don't talk about it enough, but to provide opportunities for our volunteer planners to be able to, and planning staff and others, to get information and technical assistance and education that they need, and plus mini grants that we do for a whole host of education and advocacy efforts locally in communities and in regions. So something to keep in mind. And of course, be remiss if I didn't talk about the funding through Plan New Hampshire for the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program that really kind of takes in the engagement piece, really talking about housing, making it real and relatable, and moving towards policy change that's lasting and that is understood by citizens. So, but the MTAG sort of was born out of a grant that came, $1 million grant that came to us several years ago that Ben Frost and others had written to get through. It's like, I think, a Department of Transportation, EPA, HUD grant, and it was $1 million, a lot of partners involved in that. And what that was designed to do was not just about housing, but a whole host of things for communities to look at. Some of it looking at just their land use regulations, looking at and establishing bike and pedestrian paths, and some were looking at housing. So I just wanted to share a couple examples because I think it highlights the importance of how we try to get things done. So Salzbury, New Hampshire was one example. It's a small town. They consider themselves distinctly rural with a lot of single family residents and small businesses. But they were they came together and were talking about their housing issues and didn't understand the impact of the current land use regulations they had on the things they thought that they wanted, and until it was sort of illustrated to them. And so then they looked and said, okay, let's take a look of how we can create more housing choice. And they focused on this crossroads in their town to try to do an expanded mixed use, so commercial and residential. And so they did a charrette and did a whole host of other listening sessions to really connect with community about what they could do about it. So this is kind of an example of, mark it on your calendar, doing a design charrette to look like, how can we develop but keep the historic character? That's talked about a lot, and create a town green. And there's Jack Meddy and a few others that are having, having a conversation about that, and a lot of use of what things looked like. And they illustrated what their current land use regulations didn't allow them to do. And through a lot of citizen listening and engagement, they were able to kind of look at changing the land use regulations to get what they want. I haven't checked back to see what's happened. And that's an important factor that, you can make changes, but sometimes it can take a long time. The next one is Lancaster, New Hampshire, which is a great example. Another fairly, in terms of median size population, that's sort of our median in New Hampshire. And they were looking at their downtown Main Street and what things could look like. And theirs was to, again, make sure things looked good, but could maybe do a variety of different things. And so they had a charrette as well. There's a vacant piece of property you can see in that picture. The camera is shooting from it, I think. But there was a vacant property across from this very well-liked historic building in downtown Lancaster. And after looking at zoning, looked at what a picture might look like of what they wanted, and they realized they took that building in the other picture and reversed it and said, if we can make something look like this, we don't care what can happen in between, but let's create the opportunity to keep our town looking like it is, but allowing for different uses. All of that through the CPG program really realized the power and importance of engagement with the community to really listen, respond to needs, and then come up with something that people are going to feel that they were a part of, and then participate in, and then support. But for those that want to go right to sort of what are the things we can do, this comes from a planning magazine, and sort of, there is a lot of that conversation about, let's eliminate single family zoning, embrace ADUs, and think about people over cars. But the thing is we can do that, but we need to have conversations in our town that don't start with that, but start with a very personal kind of perspective on what is our entry point in terms of our housing issue in our community, and gathering people to talk more about it, listening, and then moving from there, and keep doing that. And we can get into more details, but I think I will end with that slide, because certainly from the engagement part, Harrison and the Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition has spent a long time connecting with community, being seen as a trusted source of information, and getting people together to make change in their community.
Thank you, George. Now, Harrison, do you want to jump in and give some like real life examples and things, just some information about what the coalition's been involved in and some of that on the ground perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I can just give a quick overview, kind of some of the stuff we're working on right now, actually. One thing we've certainly been doing in the past few years is integrating more closely, not just with the community, but with the business community located in the Mount Washington Valley. They certainly are feeling the housing shortage just as much as the residents are. And they typically have access to capital. They have access to land. They have access to some of the biggest pieces of the puzzle of how do we get housing. And so working with them, we have been able to, try to figure out how they can be involved, how they can maybe start using their resources to help us and to help the community get something done as far as housing is concerned. And we've made a lot of excellent inroads as far as getting that done. Just recently, a local commercial developer said, you know what, we have to do housing. It's not something we can slack on anymore. We've never, ever done housing development, but we've got 2 lots that we can sustain about 130 single family small houses on. So if we use a density bonus that's provided by the town, so let's do it. And they want to try to make as much of that affordable as possible. And so we've been discussing with them how we can make that happen, how we can make it fit within the local aesthetics so that people are in favor of it. So we, already we're starting to see, plans are being made. And we've been talking with 2 towns in the Mount Washington Valley who have been really aggressively looking at housing, and that's the town of Ossipee and the town of Conway. And both of those communities are taking it very seriously. And it's been really interesting to talk with people of the town and see what they want, and then talk with the officials and say, how can we make this come to fruition? And again, we've had George and Robin at the time came up, or I think it was virtual. We spoke with Ossipee and talked to them about the municipal technical assistance grant and how that can kind of give them some ideas, but also give the community some ideas and kind of get a temperature of where they are on these topics. But we also have I've been working with planning boards a lot and talking to them about, the idea that ordinances and land use regulations, we need to kind of, in our area, stop thinking of them as barriers and start thinking of them as tools that we can use to drive developers where we want them to go and get them to make the things that the community wants to see, as opposed to just saying, we don't want this. We need, we're starting to look at it more of a, we do want this, and how can we get you to make this, and how can we help each other out? So that's a lot of what we've been doing, and it's been going well.
Thank you. Well, and this is for both of you, George and Harrison. Housing is such a challenge everywhere, but of course we're talking about New Hampshire. And when we're looking at the towns in New Hampshire, we often hear that people want to maintain their rural character or their historic character, different phrases like this, which of course is really important. How the community feels, what they want to feel like, what they want to be like when they grow up, if you will. And I think there's often a fear that changing land use regulations or some of these other details we're talking about is going to go against that that character that they care so much about. And I'm just wondering if either of you or both of you could speak with each other or present on it, what you think about that and what you've seen in terms of maybe that's not always the case.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of start with that. I think it's interesting to talk about that because I think the question might be is what is rural character? And I think it's important to have an open discussion about that. It's like what are the assets in our community that we really like, and what does that mean? And interestingly enough, I remember doing a charrette through the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, a big swath of land that went through Lee, Madbury, and Durham, and the charrette showed what would be built given their current zoning, which had a 3 or 4 kind of acre minimums. and they just ate up land. And they sort of realized that's really not, we'd rather have that be open. But they came to sort of the clustering piece, and how do we maybe cluster this into, homes in a smaller area. So I find that, if I was to get into, all the top three elements, it's sort of, taxes, property values, and rural character. And I think it's important to kind of have that, and hence the way of engaging with people is, that should be in the context of talking about housing and saying, what are our pain points? Who are the people that are missing? Who are the people that want to grow old here and can't? And let's have that conversation, and have a conversation about how we can make that work. I just showed Lancaster, with form-based code, it's like, we can develop something and have different uses, but it can look good. And I think it's important to try to, instead of combat it, understand it, embrace it, and say, let's dig in a little bit deeper. And Harrison, I don't know. I'm sure that comes up a lot in your area, right?
So I think the term rural character is in every single master plan and planning code in the Mount Washington Valley. I know George and I occasionally have our disagreements on this, but a part of what I do is work with communities to tell them you can keep that. We can keep the rural character and we can still get the housing. And a big part of that, two of the biggest things that we run into that communities see as antitheses of rural character is infrastructure expansion. There's, no, that's going to kill the rural character. We can't do that. And then the other thing is obviously any sort of clustering development or and again, also like apartment building, multifamily type stuff, mid-rise, I think was what we had it at the missing middle housing slide. And, I think it's really important. And I had this conversation with a community recently is, I think every community in the state, well, not every, but most communities in the state can certainly find somewhere in their town where they say, you know what, I think everyone agrees that we're okay if there's an apartment building there. That would work, that fits there, and we're okay with it. And I think that it's important for communities to have that conversation is, look, you might not want it everywhere. And it might not fit right in your downtown. It might not fit kind of in on that border between your residential and your downtown areas, but where does it fit? And really working together, again, as a community, as elected officials who know the systems within the town, but also as the community, as far as where you're okay with seeing this on a daily basis and knowing, yes, this is where we want it. And that is not going to offset the character of our community. But the infrastructure piece is huge, because we have had several instances in the Mount Washington Valley of towns looking to extend infrastructure into area, specifically water and sewer, into areas where they don't have it, that get crushed by NIMBYism, for lack of a better term. And one of the things that we have tried to discuss with people is that what we have to start seeing infrastructure as is really the supporter of rural character. When we have zoning codes that are saying you can only build on 1 or 2 acres, that starts eating into our conservation. That starts eating into our land, which is our rural character. People come here because they want to go into the White Mountains. They want to go down to the rivers. They want to go to the lakes. And if we're seeing this rural sprawl where we're taking up all of our land in using just single family homes, we're starting to lose that rural character of the ability for right now, I can go out just on the border between my neighbor's property and mine. I can cross a road and all of a sudden I'm down in conservation land. But I also know that there's some land in between there that's currently not being used. And it's a pretty big thing to consider that, if we're not consolidating our residential uses where we want them to be, and we're just forcing them to spread out, we're going to lose the rural character by losing access to what makes us rural. And so I think we need to start bridging that gap. And that's one of the things we're working on doing with communities and showing them, actually clustering our residential together. And again, it's not even clustering it necessarily as, if you look at the downtown of North Conway along the strip, you could probably get 80 units in there and no one would even know they were there. As long as they had access to infrastructure. There's a lot of infill and additional units that can be put into place that are not going to impact the character in any way, but are still going to provide housing for folks and provide it at an affordable level. So I think that's kind of the way we view that.
The other thing I would add, and I'm recalling when we had Sarah Baronin come to St. Anselm College a couple of months ago from Desegregate Connecticut, and this topic of rural character came up, and she made a great point. She was like, you call it that, and it's not defined. You should turn that into definitions that can be used by someone building that says, oh, that's what you mean by that. And I think that's the challenge, to say, well, if you want to preserve it, let's talk about what it means and put it into some kind of language code so that we can, align with it and get beyond the larger message, which might mean like we don't want anything to change.
Right. And I was just in a Conway planning board meeting where they had a new bank proposed, and they started talking about the design of it. And they brought up the design standards for Conway that specifically says it must be New England style, which means nothing. It's very open to interpretation. There's not really any definition anywhere for what that is. And so now and again, that's commercial, so it's a little different, but we're starting to get into, to your point, George, is, if we have the gray terms, it does make it harder. And I see some folks in chat talking about, it doesn't have to look like an apartment building. And that's exactly correct. And even too, we've had communities in our valley fight, multifamily apartment style buildings. And then once they're built, they go, oh, that's really nice. And that's been a huge help. And can we get that developer to come back and do another one? To which they say, no, because you're a huge pain. So it's one of those things where it certainly, towns were part of what we try to do with the education piece, is certainly bridge that gap with towns and let them know, hey, you can have it both ways. You can have what you want and have it look how you want, and still get it. It's just that there does, and I know someone also put in, there is a give that the public sector has to meet in order to make that happen. So that's certainly a big part of it.
Well, and in addition to the fear of losing that rural character and just what it might mean that people, when they say multifamily, like what people think of, there's fears there. I'm wondering what you both feel are some of the other underlying fears that are unspoken behind those terms, those big topics that, like you said, what does this even mean if we're not actually diving in and having a conversation about rural character or New England style or multifamily, then we don't necessarily have that time to think about how it really would impact our community, potentially for the better. So yeah, I just wonder if we could talk about fears a little bit more. And I really liked, I think George had something in his presentation, but it made me think of a term we used to use when I was working in community engagement in Detroit, that, you can only move as fast as the speed of trust. And I'm sorry that I'm not giving the kudos to whomever originally said that, but we said it a lot when we were planning projects and at that engagement phase. So I'll just throw that out there. And then we can also, after that, get into some of these questions that folks are bringing up in the chat, because I think there's some good stuff here.
George, you want to go first?
Okay, I was looking to see if you're gonna go. Yeah. So the thing I just want to say is, and again, I heard multifamily. I think I used multifamily. What a god awful term to use, right? And I want to go back to the context of how are we having this conversation. Now, when I come to speak, or anyone, present somewhere, I can use those charts and graphs and talk about things, and it might be understood. But in the context of trying to understand what the issue is and move forward, I think it's important to talk in real terms of people, their human housing trajectory, and others sharing that to have a shared understanding of what people's pain points are. And so having said that, though, the issue certainly is rural character. We've talked about that and ways, I think, to maybe, to deal with that somewhat. The other is that, yes, multifamily, when we think of rentals, I've heard people talk about transients, they're transients. And I think, Robin, you talk about this a lot, like and Molly Donovan from UNH, tell me about your housing trajectory. I'm sure most of us have lived in a rental unit at some point in our lives. And maybe we weren't a good, rental tenant, or maybe we were good. I lived in a rent with some roommates after college for a number of years and just were part of a house in a community. I had friends that went over for dinner, and they're keeping an eye on this one house in their single family neighborhood because apparently it's being rented out and they're concerned. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, so when we talk about multifamily as a thing, we immediately imbue those people into it. And this is the challenge of leading with solutions rather than getting down to what is happening in my community with my friends, my neighbors, and how are we talking about this? And so if we have that conversation and we discover that, I want to downsize and there's no place for me to rent, or, we've got, a business expanding, they're trying to bring in people, but there's no place for them to live and to kind of get their feet into our community. And by the way, don't we want new people in our community? And that's a question to be asked and answered. And so I think that so multifamily is a challenge. And so what do I do when someone emails me and there's a development happening? So I'll send them, and God forbid if it's a low income housing tax credit project, which we administer those tax credits, because it's got again trigger words in it. But people are thinking, what are those people doing? So what do we do? We've done a study on who lives in tax credit projects. So I send them that report, but who's going to read that report? And what's missing is the real and relatable stories about people that are living there and what their role is in their community and their economy. And we realize we're pretty well connected. So the other is my property value. This is going to make my property value go down, no matter almost what you're talking about, or it's just not going to, it's not going to pay for enough its fair share in taxes because it's going to add to school kids. So those are the things. It's property value, it's school kids, and we've done studies on that, which again reinforces a negative frame that kids are bad. Did you know that multifamily 4 units or more only produces 0.17 child? Well, I don't know what that looks like. Is that an arm and part of a torso? I don't know. But what is that in terms of our larger community? That it's good to have young people in our community, and that happens when we have a conversation about what the face of our community looks like, and that has to happen with people in our community to kind of get beyond these barriers that come up. But I also think that it's important this is where knowledge comes in a good place. When you're trying to deal with it from an understanding perspective, it is good to say, well, who can we rely on that can give us some good information? So on the school piece, I'm happy that we had Dr. Richard England that did a study on this, and that was commissioned by the New Hampshire Association of Realtors, that kind of went into that, and it kind of got into, when you add kids to the population, it may not be that 10,000 per student number that we keep banding about, because it's a fixed cost, and we may have capacity in our school. Do we know what the enrollment's been over the last 10 years? Every time I look at that, I see enrollment declining, and I would think that having more kids in would be good. And then getting back to that studies, and it takes a lot of development to get one kid to come into the school system necessarily. And that doesn't mean that there aren't popular school systems that may have population increasing. But in Dr. England's study, it didn't mean that those school costs necessarily went up as well. So that's a point where, if we're asking that question in a very reasonable way as a community, that to have resources like that. The other, we just, Joe Minicozy from Urban 3 did last year we did 15 communities and looked at, what's the value per acre? How do we derive revenue in our communities? And what came out of there was that mixed use properties tend to have the highest value per acre. And that was an interesting, eye-opening piece. Now we're trying to do the other part is, what's the cost of services? And there are a lot of people, again, with knowledge necessarily, but not understanding of maybe, this house doesn't pay for itself, but I think there's a larger picture of, well, does it or doesn't it? And how are we subsidizing other areas of our community with certain other types of development? And I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained there and available when a community is at that point where they're trying to get that understanding to make the next step. So those are a couple of things. I think I went a little bit too deep into some of that, but
no, fine. And I definitely reinforce a little bit of what George said. I find that every conversation I have with people who are scared about an incoming multifamily or any sort of workforce housing at all, if it has that label or affordable. I find the fear almost always stems from two things. One is socioeconomics. I find that to be kind of the most unfortunate thing, frankly. It's really, that is the people that we almost universally agree need the most support are also the ones who kind of universally are most unwelcomed in the communities when it comes to developments that they need to support, what they make, financially, what they're able to afford. But I also, I will go on a bit with George and kind of what Malcolm Gladwell's quote there is that one of my big things is always that I find that most fear comes from the unknown. And a lot of people just don't really know what it is. And so if there's the idea of it's multifamily housing, to point, people might have some knowledge as to roughly what that means, but they don't really understand it. And with that lack of understanding, people tend to shoot immediately to worst case scenario. So what does that mean as far as the worst possible way that it can impact me and my life? And I think George really did it, sum that up really well. I was speaking with a developer just the other day, a couple entrepreneurs in our area who said the housing thing has gotten out of hand. We're just going to invest. We both have money. We're going to invest. We've never developed before, but we're going to start developing now. They're looking at a commercial property that's being underutilized. They're going to buy a portion of it and switch those commercial bed and breakfast units. They're like individual little cabins, and they're going to switch it to a residential use and make them long-term housing units, affordable long-term housing units. And we're really excited. Unfortunately, it shares a road with a bunch of ski chalets. So there's a bunch of there are some short-term rentals on the road. There are also a lot of it's almost predominantly second homeowners who turned out to, the selectmen's hearing to say, we don't want this. And one of them was invited to one of our developers was invited to one of the second homeowners' homes. The wife wanted to talk to them about affordable housing in the area. They think affordable housing is an excellent cause to be championing. And they were accosted by the husband when they got there, demanding that $100,000 of the development money go into his pocket because he's going to lose out on his investment in his property because his property value is going to tank. So it's certainly those types of stories that we hear, people bringing this stuff forward, these concerns, to George's point, property values, what is that going to mean for my investment? What is that going to mean for my property taxes? All these things. I find that as you chip away at those, as you bring forward the understanding, the knowledge, the compassion that's needed to really combat a lot of those fears, ultimately it does boil down to kind of one thing, which is that you can't guarantee who's going to be there, and therefore I will not support this or allow it in any way. And I kind of, George and I were on a call earlier where I kind of liken this, I call it the flat earth paradox. There are people who say the earth is flat. No matter how much evidence to the contrary is thrown at them, no matter you put them in a rocket and send them up and show them, it doesn't matter. The earth is flat because that is what they believe. And so ultimately, I find that a lot with housing too, is when you get to people who are scared about what is multifamily or what is that going to mean for our community, you got to go through the motions. You have to present them with the evidence. You have to try to bring them to the water, but ultimately, whether or not you can get them to drink is something different entirely.
Well, maybe a little personal anecdote is my family. We just bought a house in East Rochester, and it's directly across the street from 12 units that are owned by the Rochester Housing Authority. And, just as newcomers to the community, there's the wonder too, like who already lives here? What kind of neighborhood did we move our kids to? And are the neighbors going to be friendly, and et cetera? And we met a couple of the folks from across the street just yesterday outside. And one of them, Mr. Bob, he literally said the words, "Thank you for coming and being a part of our neighborhood." And it just like melted my heart. And I'm like, this is what I want in my neighborhood or where I'm going to be living. And it made me feel so confident in the decision we made. But I think there were a lot of people at the open house that I went to that were, fearful of that property. Well, what's that property over there? It's just a 2-story, pretty innocuous, like housing, but a little bit different than the rest, So just throwing that little personal anecdote in since it just happened. But I like where this conversation's going. I really like some of these questions that are in the chat, and they are whole meaty topics on their own. But I think if we could address a few of them, even briefly, the first one that was mentioned closer to the top of the chat about short-term rentals, and you were just talking about second homeowners, which not that that's always a short-term rental situation, but sometimes, you know, people Airbnb their house out or whatnot. So I wonder if we could touch a little bit on short-term rentals, and Kathy specifically mentioned the proposed legislation, but just what do you guys see going on with that right now, and how community, I'll just open it up.
I have to tread very lightly here, as George knows. It's certainly a huge part of the culture in the Mount Washington Valley, and I think for a lot of the North Country in New Hampshire. I mean, we are a very tourist-based economies scattered throughout the North Country, and short-term rentals have definitely brought more folks in, which is economically beneficial to us. As to what that means for our communities, it's really unfortunate that we didn't start tracking this stuff earlier, because really we're at a point where it's a tipping point and we don't have a ton of data, as to what this means for our communities or what it has done for our communities. We have a lot of anecdote, but I think that what we look at, something that we came up in my board meeting this morning as we were talking about this exact same subject is we've got to reconcile at some point that whatever issues, if there are coming from short-term rental, there's kind of a greater issue of, and George showed it on his slide earlier, is that units are not being created. Now, as far as once those units are created, how do we keep them from being short-term rentals? How do we get people in them? That maybe is a conversation worth having. But as we're looking at currently, what impact is short-term renting having? Certainly, we know that we've seen a diminishment in and I know from talking with our ski resorts, a huge diminishment in seasonal renting has been a huge issue for the Mount Washington Valley. Whether or not that's directly related to short-term rental, again, we don't have the data to substantiate that, but it certainly is an issue that has become more relevant for specifically the ski industry in the past couple of years. And again, we look at it as there are a lot of folks who have been doing it for a very long time. A lot of these units will never become long-term rental units because, again, they're vacation homes, and you can't really come up and enjoy the weekend when you've got a tenant. You're crashing the tenant, every couple of weekends, especially in the winter or the summer months. So it is definitely something that we are keeping an eye on and we're interested in. As to what impact the legislation could have, that's a fantastic question. I'm not really 100% sure what impacts that could potentially have as far as housing stock is concerned. I know certainly that, some of our communities are trying to take different approaches to, again, how do you keep new housing stock from becoming short-term rental? We're starting to look at density bonuses that are tied to occupancy. So yeah, you can have a much higher density for building if all or some of the units are specifically deed restricted as being occupied as primary residencies, right? So now those units cannot be short-term rental; they must be lived in, either by a long-term renter or by an owner of the unit. And again, that goes down a big rabbit hole of how do we enforce that? How do we make that happen? But the reality is, we've got to try, and we've got to go somewhere with it. So that's kind of where we are on that topic.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. I think, as a housing organization, we're looking at it and actually want to, I think, try to study it more. I think, Harrison, in your board meeting this morning, someone talked about some study that was done in New Hampshire, but I didn't know what that reference was.
Yeah, there was I want to speak ill of anything. There was a study done by an economics professor out of UNH that the study was done at the behest of a pro short-term rental group. So that data is what it is for what it's worth. I think also what little data I have found for short-term rental in the North Country, if you haven't looked at it, North Country Council put out a housing needs assessment recently. It's up on New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's website. And I want to say it's somewhere around page 11 or 12. There's some figures on short-term rental income. And again, just from our purposes, we don't have any hard data besides that, and that shows that a short-term rental can make about 3 times what a median income rental can make in the Mount Washington Valley. So we definitely, you look at it just purely economically, what is the incentive of being a long-term, being a landlord for the long-term rental if you can make 3 times as much money? So it's certainly something that we are looking at, but again, as far as data to substantiate whether or not that economic value has actually caused a diminishment in long-term units, we don't know. It's largely anecdotal. We don't have any hard figures. So we're definitely looking into it and keeping an eye on it.
Yeah, so I think we would like to delve into that and see if we can't do a study. That's not going to help this bill. And I think Harrison, has spoken well. I'm struck that, there's a property owner rights element of this, my right to do something with my home. But again, I mean, the real challenge is that it'd be great if there was a supply of homes being built. It was continuous, and I would think human nature, maybe some will do, a short-term rental option, and some may choose to build that, and someone's going to live there because they're trying to find a place to live and work in the Upper Valley or my Washington Valley or wherever. And but when there's not enough, other financing schemes become more attractive, right? And I think that gets back down to an earlier comment too. Of sometimes when we try to make affordable housing more complicated to build, it becomes something that a developer probably won't do, and that's another challenge unto itself. But anyway, so that's the thinking on short-term rentals at the moment. And I put the North Country Housing Study in the chat for those that want to look at that.
Thanks, George. Yeah, there's another question about the connection between density and economic development or growth for small towns, downtowns, villages, and just how they feel. And, correct me if I'm wrong, Anna, you can jump in if that there's often not, people don't understand the connection between the two. So people want their taxes lowered, or they want more economic opportunities in the community or commercial opportunities, but then they don't want density. And so her big question is how, are there resources or ideas for helping to communicate that connection and in a way that residents will be able to hear it?
I mean, I'll jump in if you don't mind, George. I mean, again, this is a lot of what I do, approaching it somewhat from the business side first. I mentioned there's a purely commercial developer who's looking to build a whole boatload of residential units if they can. And there's a piece there that I'll tie in at the end, which is really important to consider. But of course, these 2 lots that will have all of this is within walking distance of their mall. So why would, it's economically beneficial for them. They've now got foot traffic going through, and to the tune of, over 100 houses worth of people now within walking distance of their stores. Why wouldn't you want that? So they need the density though. And again, now on the community level, so the business side, obviously they're in favor of that. From the community level, it's, well, we have these lots of lands. Would you rather have 40 houses on them, of which, maybe 10 of them will be locals? Or do you want 100 houses of which 25 of them can be local? So really getting into the metrics of we need the density because we need the units. And if we're not going to put them here in places where we're comfortable having them, then we are going to start spreading them out. And again, back to the 5 L's, you start talking about the land cost, that land per unit cost, getting that as low as possible for a developer is ideal. And 2, looking at our downtowns and saying, because I know specifically it was mentioned kind of the economics of the downtown areas, again, we're a very seasonally based, tourist based economy. Having foot traffic year round is not going to hurt our businesses. Having that stable local base gets a lot of our businesses through the downtimes. And that's huge for our area as far as making sure that everything is running smoothly. And I know that, again, the urban 3 studies that New Hampshire Housing had done shows mixed use is what you want. Our biggest caveat in that, and this is to tie back to the other one, is you'll notice this developer is saying we'll build for sale units. We will not rent. We won't do it. And we have found to be our biggest sticking point with making anything like this work, is finding someone who is willing to manage both commercial and residential. Very few people in our area want anything to do with managing residential units. They just don't want to do it. They don't want the hassle. And so even if we come together and find, hey, we've got all this mixed use stuff now and you can do it, or hey, you can put all these units on, along all these residential units to get more income on your commercial units, a lot of them are going to say, well, we don't really want to do that. And again, a big part of it boils back down to the private property owners and what they want to do. And that kind of puts everyone in a tough place at sometimes, that is ultimately, again, back to someone's comment very early on, the public sector has to find ways to make it, I kind of been working with our communities to say, we have to make the development of housing something that developers can't refuse. You got to make them an offer they can't refuse. And that's density. That's a big part of it. And again, making sure that there are enough bonuses and making sure you're knowledgeable and you understand the state level systems as far as what sort of subsidy and funding is available at state or federal levels to make things like this more attractive for developers. That's a big part of it too. And so there's just a lot of moving parts, I think, to come together to make something like that really come to fruition. And again, ultimately it boils down to two things: in a small town, are the people going to come out and vote to support any changes that would make that possible, if it's not already? And then the second one being again, in the case of somewhere like Bartlett or Conway, you really have a handful of business people who own most of that commercial property. Are they willing to step up and say, we'll get into the residential thing? And can be a really hard bridge to cross. So it's definitely beneficial, but it is something that takes, I think, a long time and a lot of education to make happen.
Yeah, I don't think there's much I can add there. I think, again, I just want to, I know that everyone says that density is a bad word. I think part of it is that we think of the most dense part of it. Remember, in a community, density is, there is the economic factor of how do you make a project economically viable to build. But it isn't just that it's 20 units or 40 units. I go back to, and I think Harrison was talking about this, infill development. So, density is important. I mean, it's again, if we go back to it and we talk about as a community, like, where are our employees coming from that are, that the assisted living place needs up the street. And again, if you start to realize we're missing out on, what is it, rental units? Then if we are, and we want them, our next question is, how do we get them? And I remember saying this to someone up in Conway, that because we were talking about rental, and I think I was talking about the downtown and saying, you should allow do up to 4 stories. And I was almost not welcome back in to Conway. But it's like, if you're talking about a housing crisis and you're not willing to do something, then stop talking about it. And I think that's when you have to roll up your sleeves and say, well, what does density mean? And don't forget, some of this, like Harris is mentioning, is incremental. And I think of the Strong Towns, Chuck Marone saying, the thing to think about is incrementally up and incrementally out. And so, where do we have room to fit other things on a small piece of land that maybe isn't 20 units, but maybe it's the duplex, it's the detached accessory dwelling unit that in most communities aren't allowed, that maybe a homeowner can build. But I do agree, sometimes we have to say, like, can that be done, or is there some public subsidy that needs to go into it? But absent that, how do we make it easier for a developer to do that? And you have to understand the economics of development. You have to realize that if I want some sort of a product, you can't demand that all of them are, because you're most certainly sealing your fate that none of them will ever be built, because it won't pencil out on paper. And I think that what we try to do, and this is the challenge here, is that when the community wants to hear that may not be when we're offering education. And so it can take a long time, but we've worked in the past with the National Development Council to provide training to planners on the developers pro forma, so they understand all that upfront risk. People say, developers they just want to take profit, and they want 15 or 20%. Well, that's somewhat kind of what they need, because they're assuming all this upfront risk. I think that's eye-opening as someone, if I'm a planner in my community, to realize that, maybe that's okay. And how do I translate some of that opportunity into my land use regulations? But I think the challenge is again putting the conversation into context where we're talking about the needs of people versus just saying we need more multifamily, and then we talk about density in the worst possible way. I go back to the missing middle. There's a lot of dense things happening in there without it being a 24 unit building. So it's a real conversation. It's trying to take some of that training and being able to share it in a way. I know for us, that's why, I can put the Minicozy Urban 3 value per acre land use analysis in the chat, but it's like, 65 pages long. And so our challenge is, how do we take some of that information and kind of crop it and make it something that can be used when we're having these conversations, that at least creates an awareness and opens up an opportunity to connect more deeply with some of those other resources, because it frankly is complicated. It's a lot to talk about school costs and taxation and where your revenue comes from. You can't just say that a single family on 1 acre is like paying the bill. You have to sort of see that happen to realize that in most cases they're not, and for a host of different reasons.
Yeah, I'd just love to piggyback on that again, that density and the incremental piece, and kind of how you can make that work in your communities and get that out. Is I'm working with the town of Conway right now, who's proposing, there's in April at our vote, there's going to be a new ordinance, which is a density bonus if you're doing cluster housing. And the cluster housing is the idea is small homes, small lots. It caps the building size at 1,200 square feet. And it allows for single family or duplex, and double the normal density that is allowed for construction if you do that. That one has an occupancy requirement. It's not keyed to affordability. It's trying to go more for the angle of naturally occurring affordable, meaning it has to be used as a primary home, and it has to be a small home on a small lot. So, just by market value, that is going to be less expensive than, a large home on 2 acres. And what we are doing with the town is we're doing a charrette, but instead of having it be theoretical, we're having it being very practical. We're going and we're finding lots that could immediately use this ordinance. And we have an architect, and we have, we have a technical support, and we have all these different professionals coming together for the community, and we're going to physically show people what could be on these lots. And it's not, to George's point, it's not 24 units in one building. One of our lots, instead of having one small house on it, you could have either a duplex or 2 small houses on it. That's it. And again, it's a lot of times people get scared of that word density, but showing them what that truly looks like and what that can be on some of these lots, I think helps a lot. There's another one, there's a vacant lot right in downtown North Conway. It's been there since I was a kid. It used to have an old school on it, and it got demoed in the mid 90s. And it has just been sand for 25 years. And we're looking at, with this ordinance, you could put two duplexes on that. Without it, you can have a single family house on it, and that's it. So again, we're trying to show people this can be attractive. This can fit, and that's in a small neighborhood, right? This can fit within a neighborhood. This works perfectly, even though it's a density bonus. So really, we're taking that practical step of showing people real life applications of that right within the community and popular places where people are familiar with it, to show them that this isn't something that, necessarily is something you need to be scared of. It's something that can just provide a little more than what our current ordinance does allow. And that little more can really tip the scale as far as the community is concerned. So that's the type of stuff we see.
And if I can put what Harrison is saying again into context, so he's doing this design charrette, but it's part of a larger engagement strategy, right? And I think that because I want to go back to and Robert he said, I wish we would stop, I think, talking about housing and talking about neighborhoods. And I absolutely agree. Like, we may be talking about it here, but if we're working in a community, it's first person, real and relatable. So there isn't jargon about this stuff. It's conversations of housing trajectory, what it means to me, my history, what's going on with me and my family, even employers, what's my pain point, and what are we missing, and what does it mean? And that becomes, that becomes first person, so that when people are trying to move to a solution, that we continue to keep that conversation in a way that respects that people don't know what they don't know. And we have an obligation, if we know something, to relate it to them in a way that is not divisive, and and can be understood. And that's pictures, that's that's authentic people that are trustworthy. And so I want to say in all of this that for those that are trying to do engagement in their communities, to remember that there are resources that'll take you through that process, like the Technical Assistance Grant Program. I think I haven't mentioned here, but as a response to this, Sarah Reitzman, who many of you know used to work with the for Housing Codes from the Greater Seacoast, works now with us, and we're really glad to have her. And one of the first things we did was sort of try to take our collective thinking about engagement through all the things we've learned from Plan New Hampshire and from Molly Donovan and others, and some terrific resources, and put together a tactical guide to engagement, principles of engagement. And I think those that are into that realize, you don't lead with solutions. You have to listen that information and find a way to translate that into something. And that gets down to what Harrison's saying, because in the end, if we're trying to change a regulation that may be cluster zoning, now people early on that thought that was good don't understand that language, because at some point it's going to turn into that. And it's important to have a feedback loop and an engagement process that gets people right down to that. And I've seen places that have sort of short-circuited that and been successful, and others where it hasn't. And so I don't know what's the winning move, but I also think being authentic, building up trust, and engaging with people in our community in a long-term sustained way is probably the better way to do it. Certainly, we've seen a lot of legislation with the next group of people come in undo it. So I don't know what good that is. And I think that speaks back to, did we have enough people that understood it, that and realizing that not everyone will. I mean, I think the old adage that there's going to be 20% of the people that are for something, 20% that are not, but the big middle of 60% that is where a really important part of that work has to be done, and in a iterative way that makes sure it gets to people, because not everyone's going to be on board at the same time.
And one last thing to cap it off is, it is also important to note that the work I'm doing with Conway right now, and that whole cluster ordinance, any PR related to it, the kind of design charrette we're doing with it, all was made possible by mini grant through New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. So it's, certainly make use of those resources when you can.
Thank you. You guys, this is like such a rich conversation. I wish we didn't only have 12 minutes left, but I do want to open it up. I know some questions have been in the chat, but I want to open it up for people to unmute themselves as well. If they have something specific they'd like to ask, and maybe just for starters, we can also spend a couple minutes on Sheena's question about, what can we do when the gatekeepers in our community seem to be preventing even just housing proposals from coming forward? I mean, is there anything we can do, or is this just like unfortunate, or what do you guys think? And yeah.
If you have the contact with those people who feel they're being dissuaded, I think the best thing you can do is have them propose it anyway. I think that there are a lot of community. I mean, it depends on the community, really. I'm speaking from, if I knew this was happening in the Mount Washington Valley, I know the communities in the Mount Washington Valley, and that right now the barometer is very much, we want housing, and we want to see any and all proposals so we can at least see them and talk about them. And that's coming from the public end. So if there were someone in the system that I felt were holding things up, I would advocate to the developer, please bring it forward anyway. Even if you're being told that this might be looked on negatively by the elected officials, it's important to, at times, I feel, leverage the system, which that system is that these people are elected. And if the public wants to at least see these things, we need to make sure that they're being brought before elected officials, being brought to public hearings, so that the public can come forward and discuss how much these things are important to them, so that people know. And so I think that that's a big part of it, is that advocacy. And again, that's when you are looking at the advocacy of the community level. How many people can you get to turn out to a planning board meeting to talk in favor of something? It's as I think anyone who's worked in advocacy knows, it's real easy to get people out to talk against something. That's not hard. But getting people to come out and speak in favor of it, that's where the work pays its dividends, and it's certainly the hardest end of that work. But yeah, push through the singular roadblocks so that the community can have its voice heard, I think, is a big part of that equation.
Yeah, and so I'll pick up on that as I'm reading that. There's a lot of things that are triggering. If a developer is looking for desirable uses, it's making me think that maybe the zoning is not clear enough. That tells me, or maybe there's a lot of, you've got to go to the zoning, got to get a variance for this, or conditional use permit or whatever. So I may be reading too much into that, but the thing that I would say on the other side of it is, absent this development, is they're saying there's gatekeepers preventing housing proposals from coming forward. And if there's something to be done about it, I go back to this tactical advocacy. If you think there's a problem, the question would be, is it shared by somebody else? And can we have a conversation about that? And I think that's kind of where Harrison's going, is, and let's talk about what is unclear in our zoning that's making a developer having to contact the town administrator, number one, to get clarity on desirable uses, which means that there's so many mechanisms and measures in place in my zoning that they're unclear, if they do Y, that it's gonna pass. And so that's where this lack of clarity is really stopping development. If in your zoning, it's a complicated process to build something beyond single family detached, you need to look at that, because that is a barrier. I think it was mentioned earlier about what developers developing, they're taking the path of least resistance. As Harrison said, how do we make this path, whether it's affordable housing or different types of housing, how do we make that so that it's something that's as easy to do? And for a developer, time is money. So if it's going to be a lot of planning board and zoning board hearings, it's not going to happen. And if it happens, now it's going to be less likely to be something that might be cheaper, because that costs a lot of time and effort and money up front to make it happen. So I would think, Sheena, let's have a larger conversation with people in your community about that. What is it about zoning? Maybe that's a challenge. Maybe have someone look at it. If it's a town administrator, I mean, if we know who that is, how do enough people sort of get out and have that conversation? They're supposed to be doing the work and carrying out policy that the community votes on.
Are there any other questions that folks would like to ask our presenters or the group while we're all together? We have about 6-7 minutes left.
Barbara had a bunch of yes/no questions. I don't see them anymore.
Yes, she asked about citizen planning academies, yes or no, and then form-based codes. Are they worth fighting for or not? I love the brevity and just like getting it out there.
Very much. I citizen planning academies. I think that, I think of Noah and Stephanie. I mean, they do a lot of training through Office of Planning and Development. And that's interesting. I mean, I'm curious if Noah and Stephanie have any thoughts on that. I think it's a great idea. I think that trying to provide training to volunteer planners, but also citizens in the community, to understand the connection of planning and zoning to what gets in the community. A lot of people just don't know that. sorry to put you guys on the spot, but this could be a good opportunity to say anything.
Yeah, I agree. I think the citizen planning academies, I think, is a great idea. I do also hedge on we need we need planning academies for some of our planning boards as well. I think we a lot of times get folks in who don't take advantage of the various educational opportunities. But I think making the communities understand what they might be voting on and how their communities work in that regard, I think is really important. And I know as I have gotten more and more engaged with those things, I find more and more of my friends and acquaintances kind of in conversation asking, so how does that work, or how would that work, or if we wanted to do this, how is that possible? So I think there's an interest out there. And as far as form-based code, I think it's a really interesting topic. I think between a lot of communities' design standards and their zoning use regulations, I almost, maybe I don't understand form-based. I don't think I understand it enough. I've tried to get as educated on it as I can, but I look at some of my community's codes as they stand and I say, well, this kind of is, or kind of designating the form already. It's just very wordy in how they do it. So which I think is maybe part of the attraction of a form-based code, is it's a bit less hard to navigate. But I certainly like the idea. I just wish I knew more about it.
Noah, did you have anything you wanted to throw in there?
I think Stephanie did.
Or Stephanie?
Sure,
Okay.
Can you
Go
hear
ahead,
me?
Noah. Go ahead, Noah.
Okay. And sorry, I'm talking on my phone. My computer is giving me issues. So hopefully y'all can hear me. Okay. Yeah, I would just say, I think we're constantly, as George pointed out, where OPD is constantly trying to kind of innovate, kind of put out new trainings. I think that we can sometimes, we're in our position, we're trying to put out kind of information to help inform land use board members on procedures and substance, and not get into the camp of necessarily kind of advocating for a certain outcome, whether it be more housing or whatever it may be. So, I think there's a lot of information, and we've done a lot of webinars in the past about kind of like what are good planning principles, especially around housing, what are some myths that can be busted, what are resources for doing housing development. For example, we'll be hearing more about this when we put our agenda out in the next 2 weeks, but at our upcoming virtual annual OPD conference on May 7th, we're going to have a session on housing resources for rural areas that are on well water and septic. So we definitely do a lot of that kind of training. I think there's always opportunities to do more of that. If SB 400 passes, there's the provision in there basically just emphasizes that our office has to provide training to planning and zoning board members. And I think probably all of you will be looking at us to try to see if there's other opportunities. But that's not to say that I think that we should be the only, I think we're a great resource. I think that, I think George's shop at New Hampshire Housing is great. They put out a lot of stuff. I don't think it has to just be all one shop or another. I think it's a combination of just need a lot of training available out there for people. And I guess that's what I have to say on this.
Yeah, I'll throw in my 2 cents. I used to, tell my boards, we're only as good as the regulations that we have in front of us. So, we've been doing Office of State Planning, Office of Energy Planning, Office of Strategic Initiatives, all of our offices. That's one of our main charges in the RSA, is to provide planning and zoning training. And has that expanded in the past several years, decades? Yes, it has. But we're only as able to reach people as much as we're funded. So, we do planning for, we do the training for planning and zoning boards. We do have our handbooks. We do this as best we can with how much we're allowed to expend. And the same goes for our, some of our main partners, the RPCs and New Hampshire Housing and New Hampshire Municipal. And we're only as good as how far we can reach. So and we're kind of in that target audience where we're mostly dealing with municipalities and we're mostly dealing with board members. How do we get outside that bubble? Money talks, and work can walk is kind of how I think about it. I mean, it would be great if this program passes and it does, end up in some way, shape, or form that we're involved with it. That would be great. But, there's also has to be that give and take where you have to realize sooner or later that you need funding to get you where you need to go. And that if that's with outreach, that's with education, that's with, as many programs as we can come up with the 5 of us planners here in the Office of Planning and Development. It's a lot of work and it's much needed. And what that segue is, what that bridge is going to be, I don't know the answer to that, but we are already doing it as best we can and have been, trying to carry that torch for that education for planning and zoning boards. And the other part of that ingredient is the citizen training. And how do we get to that? That's the $1 million question, $100 million question.
Thank you, Stephanie. That could probably be its own workshop session where we just like ideation session.
Yeah.
It's 1:30, so I am very mindful of that, and we have hit our time. George or Harrison, do you have any parting words or anything you want to say before we officially sign off?
I would just say thanks. I hope this conversation was helpful. Know that there are resources, Plan New Hampshire, UNH Cooperative Extension, New Hampshire Housing Coalitions, to try to help you in your work in your own communities and neighborhoods, to try to have an honest conversation and to make the changes that you think are needed in your community.
Thank you.
And I'd just say thank you to everyone for joining. And, while my specialty and understanding is based more in the Mount Washington Valley, I'm happy always to discuss housing throughout the entire state. So I'm happy to bounce ideas or thoughts off anyone. Feel free to reach out at any time.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here today. Thank you everyone for joining us. We will be sharing this recording out as well as a few links to some of the resources that were discussed today. And thank you to our sponsor, North Branch Construction, for helping us be able to put on these programs. I really appreciate everyone's time, spending your lunch hour with us. Hopefully most of you ate, or maybe now you're gonna go snarf your lunch like I am, but thank you everyone. And thank you, George and Harrison.
Thank you. Bye-bye.